In 1962, 17 coal miners went down into the Blackwater Mine in Matewan, West Virginia, for their morning shift. None of them ever came back. The official report said a huge methane blast had caved in 3 tunnels, trapping the miners inside. The company paid money to the families. The mine was shut for good, and Matewan tried to move past its loss. But 50 years later, when the county sheriff was sorting through old files, he found something that didn't match what the town had always been told. A sealed room deep underground that showed no sign of any blast. What he found inside would make him reopen a case powerful people had tried to bury for half a century, proving that the darkest secrets are often closest to home. Sheriff Danny Morrison had avoided clearing out the old records room for years, but the new computer system meant every paper had to be scanned, sorted or tossed away. It was boring work he did after hours, when the building was quiet and he could think. The storage basement smelled of dust and old files. Boxes stacked from floor to ceiling, dating back to the 1940s. Most of it was dull paperwork, property arguments, small arrests, budget sheets nobody would ever care about again. But Danny was careful by nature, the type of cop who read every page before deciding whether to keep it. That's how he came across the file marked Blackwater Mine Incident, 1962. The folder was thick, stuck between a pile of traffic tickets and courthouse repair notes. Danny had grown up hearing the story. 17 miners killed in an explosion, the worst accident in Matewan's history. His own grandfather had worked the mines before moving into construction. He always said mining was dangerous, but it paid well for a man with few choices. Danny pulled out the file and set it on the worn wooden table he used as a desk. The report was yellowed, typed on an old machine with fading letters. The header read, Mingo County Sheriff's Department, with the date stamped under it. April 20. Location, Blackwater Mine, Route 52, Matewan, West Virginia. Incident type, worksite accident, multiple deaths. The report said that at about 11:47 a.m., a methane blast shook the east section of the mine. 17 miners were inside at the time. All were believed dead when the tunnels caved in, and rescue teams couldn't reach them. Then came the list that made Danny's heart freeze. 17 names, 17 men who never returned home, 17 families ruined in one morning. But one name made him stop completely. Morrison James Patrick, age 31, lead foreman. His grandfather's name. Danny felt a chill in his stomach. His grandfather had died when Danny was 12, but he was always told it was from a heart attack. His family never talked about him being a miner. Danny's father always said his grandfather built houses, far from the dangers underground, yet here his name was listed as the foreman who died in the Blackwater Mine blast. Danny flipped through the file, searching for more. There were black and white photos of the mine's entrance, rescue crews, and men in suits talking to reporters. But what caught his eye was a handwritten note, clipped to the back, investigation incomplete. Suggest further check of company safety rules and timeline. Witness accounts show conflict. Deputy R. Collins. Under that, in different writing. Case closed by order of Sheriff Hawkins. No further action needed. Danny stared at it. Someone wanted to dig deeper, but was told to stop. Why would a sheriff shut down a probe into 7? The next paper was a deal between Cumberland Coal Company and the miners' families. Each family got $5,000, good money in 1962, but far from enough for losing a husband and father. Stranger still, the whole case wrapped up fast. The blast happened April 20. By May 15th, less than 3 weeks later, every family had signed, and the mine was sealed. Danny knew from experience that accident cases dragged on for months or even years, especially with so many deaths. Companies usually fought payments, insurance demanded long reviews, and families hired lawyers. But here, everything ended in weeks. At the bottom of the file was a manila envelope, marked Evidence, property of Cumberland Coal Company. Inside were geological surveys, full of charts and mineral notes. Danny didn't understand, but one phrase appeared again and again. High-grade uranium ore deposits, estimated value $2.3 million per ton. Danny leaned back, the pieces snapping together. In 1962, Uranium was priceless. The Cold War was in full swing. Nations were building nuclear weapons as fast as they could, and uranium was key. If the Blackwater Mine held ore worth millions per ton, this wasn't just an accident. It could have been a cover-up. His radio crackled, making him jump. "Sheriff Morrison, you cop." He pressed the mic. "Go ahead. Got a call from the state mining inspector. They want a meeting about old mine safety files for a federal review. Should I set it up?" Danny looked at the papers spread on the table. His grandfather's name on the list. The hidden uranium reports no one had seen. "Tell them I'll call back," he said. "I need to check something first." He hung up and made a choice. He would drive to the old Blackwater Mine and see what was left of the place where his grandfather supposedly died 50 years ago, because this file didn't add up. And if Danny had learned one thing in 15 years as a cop, it was this: when the official story wrapped up too quickly, it usually meant someone was hiding something. He packed up the file, locked it in his truck, and headed onto Route 52. The Blackwater Mine was only 20 minutes away, but Danny had never been there. Never had a reason to visit the site of a tragedy so old. Yet, as the mountain roads twisted ahead of him, he couldn't shake the thought that his grandfather hadn't died the way he'd always been told. And if that was true, then maybe 17 other families had been lied to as well. The only question was, who lied, and what were they covering up? The road to the Blackwater Mine had been abandoned almost as long as the mine itself. Danny's patrol car bounced over potholes and cracked asphalt that nature was slowly reclaiming, weeds growing through the gaps, like green fingers trying to erase the past. The entrance gate hung open on rusted hinges, a faded sign still visible: Cumberland Coal Company, authorized personnel only. Below it, someone had spray-painted "Danger, Keep Out" in red letters that had bled down the metal like dried blood. Danny parked beside the gate and stepped out into the mountain silence. The air smelled of pine trees and old coal dust, with an underlying dampness that seemed to seep up from the earth itself. 50 years of weather had softened the industrial scars, but the bones of the operation were still visible. Concrete foundations where buildings had stood, rusted rail tracks that once carried coal cars, and in the distance, the dark mouth of the mine shaft, sealed behind a wall of concrete and steel. He walked up the gravel road, his boots crunching on stones mixed with coal fragments that still littered the ground. The deeper he went into the site, the more wrong everything felt. Danny had seen other abandoned mines during his time as sheriff, places that had been shut down due to falling coal prices or environmental rules. Those sites looked like what they were: industrial operations that had simply stopped running. Equipment left where it fell, buildings stripped of valuable parts, decay slowly setting in over years. But the Blackwater Mine looked different. It looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry. Near what had once been the main office building, Danny found scattered papers half buried under decades of leaves. Most were too damaged to read, but he could still make out fragments: timesheets, safety reports, personnel records, the kind of paperwork that companies usually secured or destroyed when shutting down a site. More troubling was what he found near the sealed mine entrance: concrete blocks and steel reinforcements that looked far more excessive than what would be needed for a simple closure. This wasn't just sealing a dangerous shaft. This looked like someone wanted to make sure nothing could ever get in or out. Danny walked around the perimeter of the seal, studying the construction. The concrete was poured thick, with steel beams welded across the opening in a crosshatch pattern. What caught his eye were the dates stamped into the concrete at ground level: April 24, 1962, and April 25, 1962, April 24th and 25th, 1962, the day after the reported explosion, and the day after that. Danny frowned. The file had said rescue operations continued for days after the blast, as teams tried to reach the miners. But if they'd already started sealing the entrance, less than 24 hours after the explosion, how could there have been any real rescue attempt? He pulled out his phone and snapped photos of the concrete dates, the heavy reinforcements, the scattered paperwork. Then he walked back toward his patrol car, a mental list of questions piling up. Why had the mine been sealed so fast? Why had the sheriff's department been ordered to stop investigating? Why had his family never told him his grandfather died in the mine? And most importantly, what had been so valuable about this mine that someone was willing to let 17 men die to protect? Danny was halfway to his car when he saw the man watching him from the tree line. The figure stood maybe 60 yards away, half hidden behind a cluster of pines. Tall, thin, wearing work clothes and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. When Danny raised a hand in a wave, the man stepped back into the woods. "Hey," Danny called out. "You need something?" No answer. The man melted back into the trees like he had never been there. Danny's hand moved instinctively to his... In 15 years of law enforcement, he had learned to trust his instincts when things turned dangerous, and something about the way that man had been watching, quiet, patient, careful, like someone used to staying hidden, set off alarms in Danny's head. He hurried back to his patrol car, eyes scanning the trees. As he started the engine, his radio crackled. "Sheriff Morrison, you there? Go ahead. Got a call from someone asking about your location. Said he was from the state mining office. Wanted to know if you were investigating old mine sites today." Danny's chest tightened. "Did he give a name?" "Said his name was Henderson. But when I asked for a callback number, he said he'd call later and hung up." Danny looked back toward the trees where the man had been standing. No state mining inspector would be lurking in the woods at an abandoned mine. And how had anyone even known he was here? "Copy," Danny said. "I'm heading back to the office." But as he drove away from the Blackwater Mine, he couldn't shake the feeling that his visit had set something in motion. Someone was watching. Someone who didn't want law enforcement poking around a 50-year-old accident. Back at the sheriff's office, Danny spread the Blackwater Mine file across his desk and began making calls. His first call was to the West Virginia Department of Mining Safety. "I need to speak to someone about historical mine records," he told the receptionist. "Hold, please." After several transfers, Danny found himself talking to a records clerk named Betty Mason, who had worked there for 30 years. "Blackwater Mine," she repeated when Danny explained. "That name sounds familiar, but I can't place it. What year did you say?" 1962. "Explosion killed 17 miners. Let me check our database." Danny heard typing in the background. "That's odd. I'm not finding any reports for a Blackwater mine in night. Are you sure about the name and date?" Danny stared at the file spread across his desk. "I'm holding the county sheriff's report right now. 17 miners killed in a methane explosion on April 23, 1962. Sir, I've kept these records for 3 decades. We have reports for every mining death in West Virginia, going back to the 1920s. If 17 miners died in 1962, there would definitely be a state file. But there isn't one. You're sure?" "Yes, according to our database, there was no mining accident with multiple deaths in Mingo County in 1962. Danny felt a cold shiver crawl up his spine. "What about Cumberland Coal Company? Do you have records for them operating around Matewan?" More typing. "I see Cumberland running several mines in southern West Virginia in the 60s. But this is strange. Their Matewan operation shows a closure date of April 22, 1962. One day before the explosion? According to our records, yes, and it was listed as an administrative closure. No reason given." Danny thanked Betty Mason and hung up, his thoughts racing. The state had no record of the explosion. Cumberland Coal had closed the mine the day before it supposedly happened. And someone was still watching the site 50 years later. He dialed his father's number. "Dad, I need to ask you about Grandpa." His father was quiet. "What about him? How did he really die?" Another pause, longer this time. "Danny, why are you asking this now?" "Because I found a file that says he was killed in a mine explosion in 1962, along with 16 other men. But you always told me it was a heart attack." His father's voice went very quiet. "Where did you find this file?" "In the county records." "Dad, what really happened to him?" "Son, some things are better left buried. Your grandfather wouldn't want you digging into this. 17 men died. Dad, 17 families were lied to. If Grandpa was one of them..." "Danny," his father's voice was sharp. "Drop this. Trust me, some stones are better left unturned." The line went dead. Danny stared at the phone, his father's warning echoing in his head. But as he looked at his grandfather's name on the victim list, at the uranium reports in the evidence envelope, at the photos of the hastily sealed mine entrance, he knew he couldn't walk away. 17 men had died. Their families had been paid off and told to stay silent. And 50 years later, someone was still watching to keep the truth buried. Danny Morrison was about to find out why. He spent the rest of the afternoon tracking down the families of the other 16 miners. Most of the surnames were familiar, names on mailboxes, names he'd heard at council meetings, families that still lived around Matewan. But when he started making calls, he hit the same wall again and again. Henderson family? Oh, they moved away years ago. Right after old Bill died, I think. The Caldwells? Haven't seen any of them since I was a kid. Heard they went up north somewhere. Bobby Garrett's family? They lived on Elm Street once. But that house has been empty for decades. By 5 and Danny had made 23 phone calls and found 0 living relatives of the Blackwater victims. In a town where families stayed for generations, where people remembered everyone's business going back 50 years, every single family connected to the worst mining disaster in local history had simply vanished. That wasn't normal. That wasn't even possible. Danny locked the files in his desk and drove home. But his mind kept racing. He lived in a small house on the edge of town, the kind of place where he could think. After a dinner he barely tasted, he sat on the porch with a beer and his laptop, searching the internet for traces of the missing families. What he found disturbed him. Records showed 6 of the 17 families had sold their homes and moved out of state within 6 months of the mine disaster. 3 more had moved to other parts of West Virginia, far from Matewan. The remaining 8 families had simply disappeared from the records entirely. No forwarding addresses, no death certificates, no trace of what had happened to them. Danny had investigated enough missing person cases to know that entire families didn't just vanish without leaving some kind of paper trail. People had social security numbers, tax records, medical files. Someone always knew something, but the families of the Blackwater Mine victims had been erased as thoroughly as if they'd never existed. His phone rang, interrupting his research. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize.
Sheriff Morrison. That's right. My name is Carl Hutchins. I heard you've been asking questions about the old mine incident. Danny sat up straighter. Who told you that? Word travels fast in a small town, Sheriff. I was wondering if we could meet and talk. There are some things you should know before you dig too deep into this. What kind of things? The kind that got a lot of good people hurt back in 1962. The kind that could still get people hurt today. Danny felt his pulse quicken. Are you threatening me, Mr. Hutchins? No, sir, I'm trying to warn you. There's a difference. Where do you want to meet? You know the old diner on Route 119, about 10 miles north of town? I'll be there at 8 o'clock. Come alone, and don't tell anyone where you're going. The line went dead before Danny could respond. Danny stared at his phone, every instinct telling him this was a bad idea. Meeting unknown contacts in isolated locations was exactly the kind of thing that got law enforcement officers killed. But Carl Hutchins had information about the mine incident, and Danny needed answers more than he needed safety. He holstered his service weapon, grabbed his truck keys, and headed out into the mountain darkness. The diner on Route 119 had been closed for years, but the parking lot lights were still working, casting yellow pools of illumination across cracked asphalt. Danny arrived 15 minutes early and did a careful sweep of the area, looking for signs of an ambush or backup vehicles. The place appeared deserted, except for a single pickup truck parked near the diner's entrance. At exactly 8 o'clock, a man emerged from the shadows near the building. He was probably in his 70s, with white hair and the kind of weathered face that came from decades of outdoor work. He moved carefully, like someone whose joints had seen better days, but his eyes were sharp and alert. Sheriff Morrison, Mr. Hutchins. They shook hands, and Danny noticed the man's grip was still strong, despite his age. Thank you for coming, Hutchins said. I wasn't sure you would. You said you had information about the mine incident. Hutchins nodded toward a picnic table near the edge of the parking lot. Let's sit. This is going to take a while. They settled across from each other, and Hutchins pulled a thermos from his jacket pocket. Coffee? I'm good. Talk to me about night. Hutchins poured himself a cup and took a long sip before speaking. I was 22 years old then, worked at the mine for about 3 years, usually on the day shift, but on April 23rd I called in sick. Danny felt his pulse quicken. You were supposed to be working the day of the explosion. Should have been down there with the rest of them. James Morrison was my shift supervisor. Good man, fair boss. If I hadn't had food poisoning that morning, I'd be dead too. So you believe the explosion really happened? Hutchins laughed bitterly. Sheriff, there was no explosion. The words hung in the night air like a physical thing. Danny leaned forward. What do you mean? I mean those 17 men didn't die in any methane blast. They were murdered. shot down in the tunnels like dogs, and then buried behind concrete and steel so nobody could ever find the bodies. Danny's mouth went dry. How do you know this? Because I saw it happen. Hutchkins set down his coffee cup and looked Danny in the eye. I may have called in sick, but I couldn't sleep that morning. Felt guilty about leaving my crew short-handed. So around noon I drove out to the mine to see if they needed me for the afternoon shift. He paused, his hands shaking slightly, as he picked up the thermos again. When I got there, I heard gunshots coming from underground. Not one or two shots, a lot of them, like a war was happening down in those tunnels. What did you do? Hid behind one of the equipment sheds and waited. About 20 minutes later, men started coming up from the mine. Not miners, men in suits carrying rifles. And behind them came more men in work clothes. But they weren't Cumberland Coal employees. I'd never seen any of them before. Danny pulled out his notebook. How many men? 8 or 10, maybe more. They spent the next 2 hours bringing up equipment, files, boxes of stuff, loading it all into trucks that weren't marked with any company names. Did you recognize anyone? Hutchkins nodded grimly. Harold Vance, the Cumberland Coalite supervisor, and Sheriff Hawkins, both of them armed, both of them giving orders like they were running the show. Danny felt ice in his veins. The sheriff was involved up to his neck. I watched him personally supervise the concrete trucks when they came to seal the mine entrance. Must have been 6 or 7 loads of concrete, way more than you'd need just to close a shaft. Why didn't you report what you saw? Hutchkins laughed, but there was no humor in it. 2. The sheriff's department. Harold Vance owned half the county commissioners. And sheriff, you have to understand, this was not. The Cold War was hot. The government had all kinds of black projects running, and people who asked too many questions had a way of disappearing. Danny studied the old man's face in the parking lot lights. But you're telling me now? Because I'm 73 years old and I've been carrying this secret for 50 years. Because those 17 men had families who deserved to know the truth. And because Hutchkins hesitated. Because what? Because they're still out there, Sheriff. The people who ordered those killings, maybe not the same individuals, but the same organizations, the same interests. And if you keep digging into this, they're going to come for you the same way they came for anyone else who got too close to the truth. Danny leaned back, his mind reeling. Mr. Hutchkins, if what you're telling me is true, we're talking about mass murder and a conspiracy involving local law enforcement and federal agencies. That's exactly what I'm telling you. Why should I believe you? Hutchkins reached into his jacket and pulled out a small metal object, setting it on the picnic table between them. It was a brass shell casing, tarnished with age, but still clearly marked with caliber and manufacturer information. I picked this up outside the mine entrance that day, Hutchkins said. Figured someday someone might need proof that those men were shot, not killed in any explosion. Danny picked up the shell casing, turning it over in his hands. It was .306 caliber, military issue, the kind of ammunition used in government-issued rifles. There's something else, Hutchkins said. Something that might help you understand why they were willing to kill 17 men to keep it secret. He pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellow with age. I managed to grab this from one of the boxes they were loading into the trucks. Geological survey report. Danny unfolded the paper and read by the light of his phone. The document was technical, full of mining terminology he didn't understand, but one section was circled in red ink. High-grade uranium ore. Concentration 2.7% by weight. Estimated reserves 47,000 tons. Current market value $127 million. Danny whistled low. $127 million in 1962. Worth maybe 10 times that in today's money, Hutchkins said. And Sheriff, that was just the uranium. There were other minerals down there too. Rare earth elements that were even more valuable for weapons research. Danny folded the paper carefully and put it in his jacket pocket along with the shell casing. Mr. Hutchkins, if you've had this evidence for 50 years, why didn't you ever? Because they killed anyone who tried. Hutchkins' voice was flat. 3 months after the mine incident, Deputy Collins, the one who wanted to investigate further, died in a car accident on a straight stretch of road he'd driven 1,000 times. 6 months later, a newspaper reporter from Charleston who was asking questions about the mine died of a sudden heart attack at age 31. A year later, Harold Vance's own secretary disappeared completely after someone saw her photocopying company files. Danny felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. They've been killing people to cover this up for 50 years, anyone who got too close to the truth. Sheriff, I'm telling you this because those 17 men deserve justice, but I'm also telling you because if you're not careful you're going to be number 18. As if summoned by Hutchins' words, headlights appeared on Route 119, moving slowly toward the diner. Both men watched as a dark sedan pulled into the parking lot and stopped about 50 yards away, its engine running but the driver staying inside. "Time for me to go," Hutchins said, standing up quickly. "Sheriff, be very careful who you trust. This conspiracy has roots in places you wouldn't expect." "Wait," Danny said. "How do I contact you if I need more information?" But Hutchins was already walking toward his truck. "You don't. After tonight, Carl Hutchins is going to disappear just like those 17 families did. It's the only way to stay alive." He got in his truck and drove off, leaving Danny alone in the parking lot with a dark sedan and a shell casing that proved 17 men had been murdered for a uranium deposit worth over $1 billion in today's money. The sedan's driver door opened, and a man in a suit stepped out. Danny's hand moved to his service weapon as the man walked slowly across the parking lot toward him. "Sheriff Morrison," the man called out, "I think we need to talk." The man in the suit was younger than Danny had expected, maybe 45, with the kind of clean-cut appearance that screamed federal agent. He walked with the confident stride of someone who was used to being in control of situations, his hands visible but ready to move quickly if needed. "Agent James Crawford, FBI," he said, pulling out a badge wallet. "Mind if we have a conversation?" Danny kept his hand near his weapon. "Depends on what kind of conversation you have in mind. The kind where I explain why poking around in 50-year-old mining accidents might not be in your best interest, or the best interest of your community. Is that a threat, Agent Crawford?" Crawford smiled, but it didn't reach his eye. "It's practical advice from someone who knows more about the Blackwater situation than you do." Danny studied the man's face in the parking lot lights. "How did you know I was here?" "We've been monitoring communications related to the Blackwater Mine since this morning. Your phone calls to the state mining office triggered some automated flags in our system." The sedan's driver door opened, and a man in a suit stepped out. Danny's hand moved to his service weapon as the man walked slowly across the parking lot toward him. "Sheriff Morrison," the man called out, "I think we need to talk." The man in the suit was younger than Danny had expected, maybe 45, with the kind of clean-cut appearance that screamed federal agent. He walked with the confident stride of someone who was used to being in control of situations, his hands visible but ready to move quickly if needed. "Agent James Crawford, FBI," he said, pulling out a badge wallet. "Mind if we have a conversation?" Danny kept his hand near his weapon. "Depends on what kind of conversation you have in mind. The kind where I explain why poking around in 50-year-old mining accidents might not be in your best interest, or the best interest of your community. Is that a threat, Agent Crawford?" Crawford smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It's practical advice from someone who knows more about the Blackwater situation than you do." Danny studied the man's face in the parking lot lights. "How did you know I was here?" "We've been monitoring communications related to the Blackwater Mine since this morning. Your phone calls to the state mining office triggered some automated flags in our system." "Your system? What system would that be?" Crawford gestured toward the picnic table, where Danny had been sitting, with Hutchins. "Mind if we sit? This might take a few minutes." Against his better judgment, Danny nodded. They sat across from each other, and Crawford pulled out a manila folder from his jacket. "Sheriff Morrison, what I'm about to tell you is classified information that I'm sharing with you as a professional courtesy. The Blackwater Mine incident in 1962 was part of a federal operation related to national security interests during the Cold War." "What kind of operation?" Crawford opened the folder and showed Danny a document with heavy black redactions covering most of the text. "Uranium extraction for weapons development." The miners who died weren't victims of an industrial accident. They were casualties of a necessary operation to secure strategic materials for the defense of the United States. Danny felt anger building in his chest. "You're telling me the federal government murdered 17 miners?" "I'm telling you that during the Cold War, difficult decisions had to be made to protect national security. The uranium deposits at Blackwater were critical to our nuclear weapons program. When the miners discovered the true nature of what they were extracting, they became a security risk." "So, you killed them?" Crawford's expression didn't change. The operation was carried out by contractors working under federal authority. The miners were offered relocation packages to other parts of the country with new identities and financial compensation.
Most accepted, some didn't. Danny pulled out his notebook. Carl Hutchkins said he saw men with rifles coming up from the mine. He said he heard gunshots. Crawford closed the folder. Carl Hutchkins is a 73-year-old man whose memory of events from 50 years ago may not be entirely reliable. There were no gunshots, Sheriff. There was no mass murder. There was a controlled relocation of civilian personnel who had access to classified information. Then why was my grandfather listed as dead in the county incident report? Because James Morrison refused relocation. He insisted on staying in Matewan, continuing to work at the mine, potentially compromising the entire operation. He was given multiple opportunities to accept the relocation package. Crawford leaned forward, his voice dropping. Your grandfather was a patriot, Sheriff, but he was also stubborn. When he threatened to go public with information about the uranium extraction, difficult decisions had to be made. Danny felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. You killed my grandfather because he wouldn't keep quiet about a government mining operation. Your grandfather died in service to his country, just like soldiers who die in classified missions overseas. The difference is we couldn't give him a medal or a military funeral without compromising national security. Danny stood up abruptly. You murdered 17 miners and covered it up. Crawford remained seated, his voice calm. Sheriff, I understand this is difficult information to process, but you need to understand the bigger picture here. The uranium extracted from Blackwater Mine was used to build nuclear weapons that helped end the Cold War and protect American lives for decades. By killing American citizens, by making hard choices in difficult times, Crawford stood up and closed his folder. The same kinds of hard choices that are still being made today to protect national security. Danny felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Is that why you're here? To make sure I make the right choice. I'm here to offer you the same opportunity your grandfather was given. Walk away from this investigation, and your family stays safe. Your career continues uninterrupted. Life goes on as normal. And if I don't walk away. Crawford smiled again, and this time there was something predatory in his expression. Sheriff, you're investigating the deaths of 17 men who supposedly died 50 years ago. If something were to happen to you during that investigation, an accident at an abandoned mine site, maybe a structural collapse in an old tunnel, it would be a tragic but understandable occupational hazard. Danny's hand moved to his service weapon. Now that definitely sounds like a threat. It's a reality check, Crawford said. The people who ordered the Blackwater operation are still alive, still in positions of power, still making decisions about national security. They've spent 50 years protecting this secret, and they're not going to let a small-town sheriff expose it now. Crawford walked back toward his sedan, then turned around. You have 24 hours to decide, Sheriff. After that, the offer expires. What offer? The offer to walk away and live a long, quiet life. Crawford got in his car and rolled down the window. Oh, and Sheriff, Carl Hutchkins won't be available for any more conversations. He's decided to take an extended vacation out of state. Permanent. The sedan pulled away, leaving Danny alone in the parking lot, with a shell casing in his pocket, and the terrible understanding that he was now a target in a conspiracy that had been killing people for 5 decades. He got in his truck and drove home, his mind racing. Crawford's story about voluntary relocation didn't match what Hutchkins had told him about gunshots and bodies, but Crawford's threats were very real, and the implication that Hutchkins had been eliminated or forced to disappear was terrifying. Back at his house, Danny sat at his kitchen table and spread out everything he'd learned. The county incident report, with his grandfather's name, the geological survey showing uranium deposits worth billions, the shell casing Hutchkins had given him, and the photos he'd taken of the hastily sealed mine entrance. The evidence pointed to mass murder and a federal cover-up, but Crawford's warning made it clear that pursuing the truth could get Danny killed, just like it had gotten others killed over the past 50 years. Danny's phone rang, startling him. The caller ID showed his father's number. Danny, are you all right? I'm fine, Dad. Why? Because I just had a visit from 2 men in suits who said you were investigating dangerous criminal activity related to the old mine. They wanted to know if you'd said anything to me about what you found. Danny felt his blood turn to ice. What did you tell them? I told them you hadn't shared any details with me, which is true. But Danny, these men, they weren't local law enforcement. They knew things about our family, about your grandfather that nobody should know. What kind of thing? They knew about the heart attack story. They knew we'd never told you the truth about how your grandfather died. And, son, they knew your mother's maiden name, where she went to school, where she worked before she married me. They knew details about our lives that felt like threats. Danny closed his eyes. The conspiracy wasn't just coming for him. They were putting pressure on his family to make sure he backed down. Dad, I need you and Mom to go visit Aunt Sarah in Charleston for a few days right now. Danny, what have you gotten yourself into? I found out what really happened to Grandpa, and now the people who killed him are threatening anyone who might help me expose the truth. His father was quiet for a long moment. Son, your grandfather tried to do the right thing 50 years ago. It got him killed. Don't make the same mistake. Maybe it's time someone finished what Grandpa started. Danny, please. Think about your family. Think about the people in this town who depend on you. Is digging up 50-year-old secrets worth risking all of that? Danny looked at the evidence spread across his kitchen table, at his grandfather's name on the victim list, at the shell casing that proved 17 men had been murdered for uranium deposits. Yeah, Dad, I think it is. After hanging up, Danny made two decisions. First, he was going to find a way to get into the sealed Blackwater Mine and document what was really down there. Second, he was going to find out if any of the 17 miners had actually survived the 1962 incident and been forced into hiding like Carl Hutchkins claimed. Because Agent Crawford had made one mistake during their conversation. He'd mentioned that some of the miners had accepted relocation packages and moved to other parts of the country with new identities. If that was true, then some of the Blackwater victims might still be alive. And if Danny could find them, he might be able to get the testimony he needed to expose 50 years of murder and cover-ups. But first, he had to make sure his parents got out of town before the federal agents decided they were liabilities that needed to be eliminated. Danny grabbed his keys and headed back out into the mountain darkness. He had less than 24 hours to decide whether to walk away or fight, and he'd already made his choice. Danny's first stop was his parents' house, a small brick ranch on the outskirts of town where he'd grown up. The porch light was on, and through the front window he could see his father sitting in his recliner staring at the television without really watching it. His mother answered the door in her bathrobe, her face tight with worry. Danny, what's going on? Your father won't tell me anything about those men who came by. Mom, I need you and Dad to pack a bag and drive to Charleston tonight. Stay with Aunt Sarah for a few days. Why? What's happening? Danny's father appeared behind her, his expression grim. Because our son has decided to poke a hornet's nest that's been quiet for 50 years. James Morrison was my grandfather, Danny said. I have a right to know how he really died. His father stepped onto the porch and closed the door behind him. Danny, let me tell you something about your grandfather that I never wanted you to know. He was a good man, but he was also stubborn as a mule. When he got an idea in his head about right and wrong, nothing could change his mind. That sounds like something to be proud of. It is, but it's also what got him killed. His father's voice dropped to a whisper. Your grandfather found something in that mine that he wasn't supposed to see. Government men came and told him to keep quiet, offered him money to relocate the family. He refused, said he had a responsibility to his community, to the other miners. So they murdered him. They made him disappear along with anyone else who wouldn't take their money and keep their mouth shut. His father gripped Danny's shoulder. Son, I was 10 years old when it happened. I watched my mother cry herself to sleep every night for 2 years after we were told he died in an explosion. I watched our neighbors pack up and leave town one by one, until there was nobody left who remembered what really happened. Danny felt something cold settle in his chest. How many people knew the truth? Everybody knew something was wrong. You don't lose 17 men in an explosion and have it wrapped up in 3 weeks, unless powerful people want it wrapped up. But nobody talked about it because the families who asked too many questions ended up like the Hendersons. What happened to the Hendersons? His father was quiet for a long moment. Billy Henderson's widow refused to sign the settlement papers, said she wanted a real investigation into how her husband died. 3 months later, their house burned down in the middle of the night. Martha Henderson and her 2 kids died in the fire. Official cause was electrical problems, but everybody knew better. Danny felt sick. They killed a woman and her children. They killed anyone who threatened to expose the truth, and now you're threatening to do the same thing. His father looked toward the street where a sedan with tinted windows was parked under a streetlight. They're watching us right now. Danny, those men who came by earlier, they're still here. Danny followed his father's gaze and saw the car. It hadn't been there when he arrived. All the more reason for you to get out of town tonight. Danny said, drive to Charleston, stay with Aunt Sarah, don't tell anyone where you're going. His mother appeared in the doorway again. Danny, why can't you just let sleeping dogs lie? Your grandfather's been gone. Digging this up won't bring him back. But it might bring justice for 17 families who were lied to and threatened into silence. And it might get you killed. His father said, is that what you want? Is that what your grandfather would want? Danny thought about the shell casing in his pocket, about Carl Hutchins's terrified face in the diner parking lot, about Agent Crawford's casual threats. His father was right. Pursuing this investigation could get him killed, but it could also expose a conspiracy that had been murdering innocent people for half a century. I'll be careful, Danny said. But I can't walk away from this. His father nodded slowly. I knew you'd say that. You're just like him, you know. Same stubborn streak, same sense of right and wrong, he sighed. We'll pack a bag and leave tonight. But Danny, if something happens to you, if you disappear like your grandfather did, I want you to know that we understand why you did it. Danny hugged both his parents, knowing it might be the last time he saw them. As he walked back to his truck, he noticed the sedan's engine start up. They were going to follow him, which meant his parents would be safe once he led the surveillance away from their house. Danny drove toward the center of town, taking a circuitous route that would give his parents time to pack and leave. The sedan stayed behind him, maintaining a professional distance, but making no effort to hide their presence. They wanted him to know he was being watched. At the sheriff's office, Danny parked under the lights and walked inside, knowing the surveillance team would have to decide whether to follow him into a law enforcement building or wait outside. They chose to wait. Danny went to his desk and opened the locked drawer where he'd stored the Blackwater Mine files. Everything was still there, but something felt different. The papers were stacked slightly differently than he'd left them, and there was a faint smell of cologne in the air that hadn't been there before. Someone had been through his desk. Danny gathered up the files and his laptop, then walked to the back exit of the building. His patrol car was parked in the rear lot, away from the street where the surveillance team was waiting. If he was lucky, he could get a few hours head start before they realized he'd slipped away. But first, he needed to make a stop that might get him the breakthrough he needed. 20 minutes later, Danny pulled up in front of a small house on the edge of Matewan's industrial district. The address had taken him an hour of searching through property records, but he'd finally found what he was looking for: the current address of Ruth Morrison, his grandfather's sister. Aunt Ruth was 86 years old and lived alone in a house filled with 50 years of accumulated memories. She answered the door in a housecoat, her white hair in curlers, squinting at him through thick glasses. Danny, what are you doing here at this hour? Aunt Ruth, I need to ask you about Grandpa James. Her expression changed immediately, weariness replacing confusion. What about him? I found the real file about how he died. I know about the mine, about the uranium, about what really happened to those. Ruth Morrison looked past Danny toward the street, checking for surveillance, then pulled him inside and locked the door behind him. You shouldn't be here, she said. They're probably watching. Who's watching? The same people who've been watching our family the same people who made sure nobody ever talked about what really happened at Blackwater. Ruth led him to the kitchen and put on a pot of coffee, her hands shaking slightly as she worked. Danny, there are things about your grandfather that your father doesn't know. Things I promised never to tell anyone. What kind of things? Ruth sat down across from him at the kitchen table. Your grandfather didn't just refuse to take their money and keep quiet. He was documenting everything that happened at that mine. He had proof of the uranium extraction, proof of the government involvement, proof of the cover-up. Danny leaned forward. What happened to the proof? He hid it somewhere safe, somewhere he thought nobody would ever find it. Ruth's eyes filled with tears. The night before he died, he came here and gave me a key, said if anything happened to him, I should give it to someone who could use it to get justice for the other families. She stood up and walked to an old grandfather clock in the corner of the kitchen. Behind the pendulum, taped to the back panel, was a small brass key. I've been carrying this secret for 50 years, Ruth said, handing Danny the key, waiting for someone in the family to be brave enough to finish what James started. Danny turned the key over in his hand. It was old and tarnished, with numbers etched into the metal. What does it open? Ruth smiled for the first time since he'd arrived. Your grandfather rented a safety deposit box at the First National Bank in Logan County under a false name. Everything he documented about Blackwater is in that box. Danny felt his pulse quicken. What name did he use? Patrick Morrison, his middle name and our maiden name. Ruth gripped his hand. Danny, if what's in that box is as damaging as your grandfather believed, the people who killed him won't hesitate to kill you too. I know, but Aunt Ruth, if I don't do this, they'll keep killing people to protect their secret. How many more Carl Hutchkinses are going to disappear? How many more families are going to be threatened into silence? Ruth nodded slowly. Your grandfather would be proud of you and terrified for you. She walked to the window and peered through the curtains. There's a car across the street that wasn't there when you arrived. Danny joined her at the window. A different sedan was parked under a streetlight, engine running. They found me, he said, which means they'll be watching the bank tomorrow. Then you'll have to be smarter than they are, Ruth said. The same way your grandfather was smarter than them, for 50 years. Danny kissed his aunt on the cheek, and headed for the back door. If anyone asks, I was never here. Danny, Ruth called after him. Be careful, and remember, your grandfather didn't die for nothing. If you can finally get justice for those 17 families. Danny slipped out the back door, and through Ruth's neighbor's yard, making his way to where he'd parked his patrol car 3 blocks away. The surveillance team would be watching the front of Ruth's house, waiting for him to leave the way he'd come in. As he drove toward Logan County and the First National Bank, Danny realized he was now carrying the key to evidence that could expose a 50-year government conspiracy involving mass murder and corporate cover-ups. But he was also being hunted by federal agents who had been killing witnesses for half a century. The race was on to see who would get to James Morrison's safety deposit box first. Danny, or the people who had murdered his grandfather to keep him from opening it. The First National Bank in Logan County opened at 9 a.m., but Danny arrived at 7:30 to study the building and plan his approach. The surveillance sedan had followed him part way, but disappeared once he crossed county lines, which meant they either had other assets in place, or they were confident they knew where he was going. Danny parked 2 blocks away and walked through the early morning mist that clung to the mountains around Logan. The bank was a small brick building from the 1960s, the kind of place where safety deposit boxes were accessed through a basement vault that probably hadn't been updated since his grandfather's time. At 8:45, Danny watched from across the street as 2 men in suits entered the bank. They weren't customers. Their posture and the way they scanned the interior screamed federal agents. Crawford's people had beaten him there. Danny's radio crackled. Sheriff Morrison, this is dispatch. We've got a situation at the Blackwater Mine site. Someone called in suspicious activity. Possible break-in. Danny keyed the mic. What kind of suspicious activity? Callers said they saw lights moving around inside the sealed entrance. Might be kids, but the property owner wants it checked out. Danny felt his stomach drop. The timing was too convenient. I'm in Logan County on official business. Send Deputy Williams to check it out. Williams is responding to a domestic disturbance. You want me to call the state police? Negative. I'll handle it when I get back. But Danny knew the call was fake. Crawford's people were trying to draw him away from the bank, back to the mine, where they could isolate him and eliminate the problem permanently, which meant whatever was in his grandfather's safety deposit box was dangerous enough to kill for. At exactly 9 Danny walked into the First National Bank. The 2 federal agents were standing near the customer service desk, showing badges to the bank manager. Danny couldn't hear their conversation, but he could see the manager nodding nervously and pointing toward the basement stairs. Danny approached the teller window with the key Ruth had given him. I need to access a safety deposit box, please. The young teller looked past Danny toward the federal agents, uncertainty crossing her face. Sir, I think you need to speak with Mr. Patterson, our manager. He's dealing with some kind of situation right now regarding the safety deposit boxes. What kind of situation? I'm not sure. Those men said something about a federal investigation into fraudulent accounts. Danny felt ice in his veins. Crawford's people were trying to seize his grandfather's box before he could access it. In a few minutes, 50 years of evidence would disappear into federal custody and never be seen again. Danny looked up at Patterson, who was recording everything with his phone. Keep going, Patterson whispered. Danny continued reading. On April 20th, 1962, 3 days before the murders, government scientists arrived at the mine with equipment I'd never seen before. They took core samples from the deepest tunnels and confirmed what they already suspected. The Blackwater Mine contained enough rare earth elements to supply the entire U.S. military for decades. But here's what they didn't expect. We miners had been talking to each other about the strange rocks we'd been finding. Some of us had taken samples home to show our families. A few had even taken samples to geology professors at the state university. When the government men realized we'd been collecting samples, they panicked. They couldn't let civilian scientists analyze elements that were supposedly secret for national security reasons. So they decided to eliminate all witnesses. Danny felt sick as he continued reading. They offered us relocation packages first. New identities, government jobs in other states, enough money to set up our families anywhere we wanted. Most of the men were tempted. It was more money than any of us had ever seen. But I knew something was wrong. If the government was willing to pay 17 families to disappear, whatever was in that mine was worth far more than they were telling us. So I started documenting everything. I hid core samples, photographed the mining equipment, copied geological surveys, and recorded conversations with the government scientists. Everything is in this box, along with proof that the methane explosion was actually a coordinated execution carried out by federal contractors. Danny's hands were shaking as he reached the final paragraph. If you're my family reading this, know that I love you, and I'm sorry for the pain my death will cause. But these 17 families have families too, and they deserve to know the truth. The Blackwater Mine contains enough rare earth elements to be worth over $10 billion in today's money. 17 good men died so that money could be stolen by people who were supposed to protect American citizens, not murder them. Use this evidence to get justice. Use it to expose the conspiracy. And use it to make sure no other families have to suffer what ours has suffered. James Patrick Morrison, April 22, 1962. Danny set down the letter and started going through the other contents of the box. There were dozens of photographs showing the mining operation, geological surveys, documenting the rare earth deposits, and audio recordings on old magnetic tape reels. But what made Danny's blood run cold were the execution orders, typed on official government letterhead, classified at the highest levels. They were rate orders to eliminate civilian assets, with knowledge of Project Blackwater, and secure all physical evidence of rare earth extraction operations. The orders were signed by officials whose names Danny recognized from history books, people who had gone on to hold high positions in government and private industry for decades after the Blackwater murders. Jesus Christ, Patterson whispered, looking at the documents over Danny's shoulder. This goes all the way to the top. Danny picked up one of the cloth bags containing geological samples. Even 50 years later, he could see the unusual coloration and crystalline structure that marked these as something different from ordinary coal mining debris. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. You have 2 minutes to surrender the contents of that box, or we're coming down. Danny looked at Patterson. Can you upload those photos to a cloud storage account right now? Already doing it, Patterson said, his fingers flying across his phone screen, sending everything to multiple email accounts and social media platforms. Good man. Danny gathered up the most damaging documents, the execution orders, his grandfather's letter, and the geological surveys, showing the true value of the rare earth deposits. He stuffed them inside his jacket just as heavy footsteps started coming down the basement stairs. Sheriff Morris, Agent Crawford's voice echoed through the vault. This is your final warning. Surrender the classified materials and come upstairs peacefully. Go to hell, Crawford, Danny called back. This evidence is going public whether you kill me or not. Actually, it's not. Crawford appeared at the bottom of the stairs with 4 tactical agents, all armed with automatic weapons. Mr. Patterson had just discovered that his phone had no signal down here, a very convenient design feature for a bank vault. And his photos, Crawford added smoothly, they uploaded to servers that we control. Patterson looked at his phone in horror. The upload had failed. None of it had gone through. Crawford smiled. Sheriff Morrison, you're going to hand over every document, every photograph, and every sample in that box. Then you're going to forget this investigation ever happened. And if I refuse, Danny asked, then you'll join your grandfather in an unmarked grave. And the official record will show that Sheriff Danny Morrison died in a tragic mining accident while investigating reports of trespassers at the abandoned Blackwater Mine. Danny looked around the vault, calculating his options. 4 heavily armed federal agents, no way to communicate with the outside world, and evidence that could expose a 50-year conspiracy worth billions of dollars. But his grandfather had faced the same choice half a century ago, and James Morrison had chosen to hide the evidence rather than let it be destroyed. Danny was about to make the same choice. "Crawford," he said, steadying his voice, "before you kill me, answer one question. How many people have you murdered to protect this secret?" "Does it matter?" Crawford replied coolly. "National security requires difficult decisions. It matters to the families, it matters to the victims, and it's going to matter to the media when this story breaks." Crawford laughed. "What media? You're alone down here, Sheriff. No witnesses, no backup, no evidence that's going to survive the next 5 minutes." That's when Danny heard something that changed everything. Sirens, multiple vehicles getting closer. Crawford's confidence flickered. "What did you do?" Danny smiled. "I called the state police before I came in. Told them I was investigating federal agents who were interfering with a homicide investigation. Gave them the address. Told them if they didn't hear from me in 30 minutes, they should assume I was in federal custody." It was a lie, but Crawford didn't know that. The sirens grew louder. Danny saw doubt creeping into the agents' faces. "You're bluffing," Crawford said. "Maybe, but are you willing to bet $10 billion worth of rare earth elements on it?" That's when the shooting started upstairs. The gunfire was brief, but intense. Automatic weapons, handguns, even what sounded like shotgun blasts echoed through the bank's main floor. Then sudden terrifying silence. Crawford pressed his radio earpiece, his face grim. "Report." Static. Then a voice. "Building secure. Local law enforcement neutralized. No media presence." Danny's stomach dropped. The sirens hadn't been state police coming to rescue him. They'd been more federal agents arriving to contain the situation. "Disappointed, Sheriff." Crawford, "Did you really think we'd operate for 50 years without learning how to handle local law enforcement interference?" Danny's mind raced. If Crawford's people had neutralized local law enforcement, that meant other cops were dead or wounded because of his investigation. The weight of that responsibility hit him like a physical blow. "How many?" Danny asked quietly. "How many what? How many cops did you kill?" Crawford shrugged. "Does it matter? They were casualties in a national security operation, just like you're about to be." Danny looked at Patterson, who had gone pale and was backing toward the far wall of the vault. The bank manager clearly understood. He was about to become another casualty in a conspiracy that had been claiming victims for half a century. "Miss Patterson," Danny said, "I'm sorry you got involved in this." "So am I," Crawford said, "but witnesses are liabilities, and we don't leave liabilities behind." That's when Danny noticed something Crawford hadn't seen. Patterson's phone was still recording. The upload might have failed, but the local recording was still running, capturing everything Crawford had just said about killing law enforcement officers. Danny needed to buy time and get more evidence on that recording. "Crawford," he said, "before you kill us, satisfy my curiosity about something. How long has this operation been running?" "Just since 1962. Crawford checked his watch impatiently. "Sheriff, we don't have time for humor from a dead man. The rare earth elements in Blackwater. When did the government first know they were there?" Crawford smiled, apparently enjoying the chance to boast. "We've known about unusual mineral deposits in Appalachia since the What we didn't know was exactly how valuable they would become for electronics and weapon systems." "So you've been murdering miners for 80 years. We've been protecting strategic resources for 80 years. The Blackwater incident was just one operation in a much larger program." Danny felt sick. How many other mines? Dozens across multiple states. Whenever civilian miners discovered resources classified for national security, we implemented containment protocols. Containment protocols? Danny's voice was bitter. "Is that what you call mass murder?" Crawford's expression hardened. "I call it protecting American interests against foreign adversaries who would use those resources against us." Danny's eyes shifted to the cloth bags containing his grandfather's geological sample. If Crawford was telling the truth, then Blackwater was just the tip of the iceberg. The families who disappeared, Danny said, the ones who took relocation packages, What really happened to them? Some of them accepted new identities and government jobs as promised. They're living comfortable lives under federal protection. And the ones who didn't accept, Crawford's silence was answer enough. Suddenly, Danny's radio crackled to life. Sheriff Morrison, this is Deputy William. I'm at the Blackwater Mine site, investigating reports of suspicious activity. I found something you need to see immediately. Crawford lunged for the radio, but Danny was faster. He keyed the mic before Crawford could stop him. Williams, whatever you found, document it and get it to the state police immediately. Federal agents are trying to cover up a mass murder from 1962. Sheriff, what are you talking about? I'm looking at fresh excavation equipment here. Someone's been digging into the sealed mine entrance. Crawford went white. That's impossible. The site is under surveillance. But Danny understood. Williams, how fresh is the excavation? Looks like it happened within the last few hours. Sheriff, there's something else. I found an elderly man hiding in the woods near the mine. Says his name is Carl Hutchkins, and he needs to talk to you immediately. The tactical team exchanged nervous glances. Their surveillance hadn't been as complete as they thought. Williams, Danny said quickly, before Crawford could stop him. Hutchkins is a witness to the night. He has evidence. Get him to safety and contact the FBI immediately. Sheriff, there's no need for Crawford began. Not your FBI. Danny cut him off, still keying the radio. Contact the FBI field office in Charleston. Tell them federal agents are impersonating law enforcement officers in Logan County. Tell them Sheriff Morrison is being held against his will by people claiming to be Agent Crawford's team. Crawford ripped the radio from his hand and smashed it against the concrete wall. That was a mistake, Sheriff. Now we'll have to kill your deputy too. But the damage was done. Williams had heard enough, and if Carl Hutchkins was really alive, the conspiracy had lost control of a key witness. Crawford pulled out his phone and made a call. We have a problem. The Hutchkins asset wasn't neutralized as reported. He's at the mine site with a county deputy. Dispatch a cleanup team immediately. Danny's heart sank. More people were going to die because of his investigation. You know what the real tragedy is, Sheriff? Crawford said, slipping his phone away. Your grandfather actually succeeded in hiding evidence that could have exposed this operation 50 years ago. If you'd just left it alone, those 17 families might have gotten justice eventually. But now, because of your interference, we'll have to expand the cover-up and eliminate additional witnesses, including me, including you, including Mr. Patterson, including your deputy, including Mr. Hutchkins. Crawford nodded to his men, and unfortunately, including your parents, who received classified information during your investigation. Danny's blood turned to ice. My parents don't know anything. They know enough. Federal agents visited them. They heard you discussing classified matters. They could become problems in the future. That was it. Danny made a decision that would either save innocent lives or get everyone killed. He grabbed one of the geological sample bags from his grandfather's deposit box and hurled it at the nearest light fixture. The vault plunged into darkness, just as Danny dove behind a row of safety deposit boxes, dragging Patterson with him. Gunfire erupted in the confined space, muzzle flashes strobing like lightning, as Crawford's tactical team tried to locate their targets in the dark. But Danny had one advantage. He knew exactly where the circuit breaker panel was, because he'd noticed it when they first entered the vault. In 15 seconds, he would find out if 50 years of planning and murder could be undone by a small-town sheriff, with his grandfather's evidence, and a whole lot of luck. The question was whether he'd live long enough to get that evidence to the outside world. Danny crawled through the darkness toward the panel, dragging Patterson with him. The tactical team's flashlight beams cut through the vault like searchlights, and Danny could hear Crawford coordinating their movements in harsh whispers. Thermal imaging shows 2 heat signatures behind the east wall of boxes, one of the agents reported. Moving to flank. Danny reached the circuit panel and felt along the wall until his fingers found the metal box. He yanked it open and started flipping breakers, hoping to kill power to the entire building and maybe trigger some kind of alarm system. The vault went completely dark, as even the emergency lighting died. Building power is down, Crawford's voice echoed in the blackness. Switch to night vision and end this. But Danny had bought himself maybe 30 seconds, and he used them to grab Patterson and move toward the vault's rear wall, where he'd noticed a service door marked AO authorized personnel only. Behind them, he could hear the tactical team moving, with military precision, their night vision equipment, giving them a huge advantage in the darkness. Danny found the service door, and tried the handle, locked. "Patterson," he whispered, "do you have keys to this door?" "It leads to the old pneumatic tube system," Patterson whispered back. "We don't use it anymore, but it connects to the drive-through teller window. Can we get through it?" "Maybe, but it's a tight fit." Danny could hear the tactical team getting close. In a few seconds, they'd have clear shots at both of them. He pulled out his service weapon and fired 3 shots at the service door lock, the muzzle flashes temporarily blinding anyone with night vision equipment. The door sprang open, revealing a narrow maintenance corridor that smelled of dust and old grease. "Go," Danny hissed, pushing Patterson into the corridor ahead of him. They crawled through a space barely wide enough for their shoulders, following a path that Danny hoped led to some kind of exit. Behind them, he could hear Crawford's team breaking through the damaged service door. "They're in the pneumatic system," Crawford's voice echoed through the narrow corridor. "Seal all exits and flood the tubes with gas." Danny's heart sank. They were trapped in a confined space with armed federal agents behind them, and poison gas ahead of them. But then Patterson grabbed his arm. "There," he whispered, pointing to a faint rectangle of light ahead of them, the drive-through window. They crawled faster, Danny's knees scraping against the metal tube walls. Behind them, he could hear the hiss of gas being released into the system. Danny reached the drive-through window first and kicked out the pneumatic tube cover, sending it flying into the parking lot outside. Fresh air rushed into the corridor, and Danny hauled himself through the opening, then pulled Patterson out after him. They were outside the bank, but Danny could see federal agents positioned around the building perimeter. Crawford's team had the entire area locked down. "This way," Patterson gasped, pointing toward an alley that ran between the bank and the adjacent hardware store. "My car is parked behind the building." They ran for the alley, keeping low, but Danny knew they had maybe seconds before Crawford's people spotted them. He still had his grandfather's evidence stuffed inside his jacket, but it wouldn't do any good if they were both killed before they could get it to the media. That's when Danny heard the sound of helicopters approaching, but these weren't federal helicopters. As they got closer, Danny could see news station logos on their sides. "How the hell?" Patterson gasped. Danny's radio had been destroyed, but Patterson's phone had been recording everything Crawford said about killing law enforcement officers and covering up mass murder. Even though the upload had failed, the local recording was still intact, and apparently someone had been monitoring police communications. The first helicopter to land in the bank parking lot was from WCHS-TV in Charleston. A news crew jumped out and started filming everything: the federal agents, the sealed bank building, and Danny Morrison emerging from an alley with evidence of a 50-year conspiracy. "Sheriff Morrison," a reporter called out. "Channel 8, we received reports of federal agents shooting at local law enforcement. Can you comment?" Crawford appeared at the bank entrance, his face twisted with rage. But with news cameras rolling and helicopters circling overhead, he couldn't simply execute Danny and Patterson in broad daylight. "Those men are federal fugitives," Crawford shouted to the news crew. "They're in possession of stolen classified materials." "What classified materials?" the reporter shouted back. "What's this about a mining conspiracy?" Danny realized this was his chance. With live television cameras rolling, Crawford couldn't stop him from telling the truth. "My name is Sheriff Danny Morrison, of Mingo County," he called out, pulling his grandfather's letter from his jacket. "I have evidence that federal agents murdered 17 coal miners in 1962 to cover up the theft of rare earth elements worth over $10 billion. The news crew surged forward, cameras focused on Danny as he held up the documents. "This letter was written by my grandfather, James Patrick Morrison, the night before he was murdered by federal contractors. It documents a conspiracy involving the illegal extraction of strategic minerals and the systematic elimination of civilian witnesses." Crawford was shouting into his radio, probably calling for backup or air support, but it was too late. The story was already going live on television. More helicopters were arriving, state police, additional news crews, and what looked like genuine FBI agents responding to reports of rogue federal operatives. Danny's phone, which he'd somehow managed to keep during the escape from the bank vault, suddenly rang. The caller ID showed Deputy Williams. "Sheriff, are you all right? I'm watching you on the news right now." "Williams, where are you?" "Still at the Blackwater Mine with Carl Hutchkins." "Sheriff, you need to know. We opened the sealed mine entrance. There are bodies down there. 17 bodies still in their work clothes, all with gunshot wounds." Danny felt vindication and horror in equal measure. "Are you recording everything? Video, photos, everything?" "But Sheriff, there's something else. Hutchkins says there are documents hidden in the mine that prove this conspiracy goes way beyond Blackwater. He says there are dozens of other sites, hundreds of other victims." Danny looked at Crawford, who was now surrounded by state police officers and reporters. The federal agent's career was over, but the conspiracy he represented was much larger than one operation. "Williams, secure that crime scene and don't let anyone near it, except state police investigators, and get Hutchkins somewhere safe. These people have been killing witnesses for 50 years. "Already done, Sheriff. State police are en route and I've got Hutchkins in protective custody." Danny hung up and turned to face the news cameras again. With the world watching, he was going to expose every detail of the Blackwater Mine conspiracy and challenge the federal government to explain 50 years of murder and cover-ups. But as he began reading his grandfather's letter aloud on live television, Danny knew this was just the beginning. Crawford had mentioned dozens of other mining operations, hundreds of other victims, and a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government. The Blackwater Mine murders were about to become the thread that unraveled one of the longest-running cover-ups in American history. And somewhere in Washington, D.C., very powerful people were probably making decisions about how to contain the damage before it destroyed careers, corporations, and government agencies that had been built on 50 years of stolen resources and murdered witnesses. The question was whether Danny Morrison would live long enough to see justice for his grandfather and the 16 other men who had died trying to protect the truth. 6 months after the Blackwater Mine story broke, Danny Morrison stood at the entrance to what had once been a sealed tomb and was now the most extensively investigated crime scene in West Virginia history. The FBI had recovered the remains of 16 miners from the depths of the mine. His grandfather's body was never found, leading investigators to believe James Morrison had been buried elsewhere after his murder. Each victim showed evidence of execution-style gunshot wounds, exactly as Carl Hutchkins had described witnessing 50 years. But the bodies were just the beginning of what they found. Hidden in a reinforced chamber deep within the mine were boxes of documents that James Morrison had secreted away before his death, contracts between government agencies and private mining companies, lists of other containment operations across Appalachia, and geological surveys identifying billions of dollars worth of rare earth elements that had been extracted under the cover of national security. The paper trail led to mining operations in Kentucky, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Tennessee, where similar accidents had eliminated civilian witnesses to classified extraction programs. In total, investigators identified over 300 miners and their family members who had been murdered or disappeared over 8 decades of covert resource operation. Danny walked through the mine's main tunnel, now lit with industrial lighting and swarming with forensic investigators, journalists, and congressional staff members preparing for hearings that would expose the full scope of the conspiracy. Carl Hutchkins had become the star witness in what media outlets were calling the Blackwater hearings. His testimony about witnessing the 1962 murders had corroborated every detail in James Morrison's hidden document, and his 50 years of careful observation had helped investigators identify other surviving witnesses who had been living and hiding across the country. "Sheriff Morrison," Danny turned to see Congressman Michael Torres, chairman of the House Committee investigating the mining conspiracy. Torres had flown in from Washington to personally examine the crime scene. "Congressman," Danny said, shaking the man's hand, "thank you for coming. Thank you for having the courage to expose this." Torres replied, "Do you realize what you've uncovered here? This isn't just about mining operations. The rare earth elements stolen from sites like Blackwater have been the foundation of American electronics and weapons technology for decades. Cell phones, satellites, guided missiles, all of it built on resources that were literally stolen at gunpoint from American communities." Danny nodded grimly, "and paid for with American lives." They walked deeper into the mine, past evidence markers, where investigators had found bullet casings, personal belongings, and the makeshift barricades the miners had built in their final desperate attempt to defend themselves. "What's the status of the prosecutions?" Danny asked. Torres's expression darkened. Mixed results. Agent Crawford and his immediate team are facing federal murder charges, but some of the higher-level officials have claimed immunity based on national security classifications. We're fighting those claims in court, but it's going to be a long battle. And the mining companies, that's where we're having more success. Cumberland Coal Company, which is now part of a major international corporation, is facing wrongful death lawsuits from the families of all 17 Blackwater victims. The rare earth elements extracted from this site alone are worth an estimated $12 billion in today's market. The families are going to be compensated finally. Danny stopped at the spot where investigators believed his grandfather had made his final stand. Someone had left flowers there, fresh daisies that looked like they'd been placed recently. The other mining sites, Danny said. How many families are we talking about? Over 800 confirmed victims across 6 states, Torres said, and we're still identifying more as witnesses come forward. Some of these people have been living under assumed identities for 30 or 40 years, too terrified to contact their original families. Danny thought about the scope of the conspiracy: decades of systematic murder, entire communities destroyed, families torn apart, all to steal natural resources that belong to the American people. Congressman, what guarantees do we have that this won't happen again? Torres pulled out a thick folder from his briefcase. This is legislation we're introducing next month, the James Morrison Transparency Act. It will require congressional oversight of all federal resource extraction operations, mandate public disclosure of geological surveys on federal lands, and establish protection programs for civilian witnesses to government operations. Named after my grandfather? Danny asked. Named after all of them, Torres said. James Morrison, Carl Hutchins, and every person who had the courage to preserve evidence and tell the truth despite threats to their lives. They emerged from the mine into the afternoon sunlight, where Danny could see tourists and journalists still gathering to document the site where one of America's longest-running conspiracies had finally been exposed. His phone buzzed with a text message from his father, watching the congressional hearings on C-SPAN. Your grandfather would be proud. Danny smiled. His parents had returned from Charleston after Crawford's arrest, and the Federal Protection Program had relocated them to a secure location while the investigation continued. But the daily threats and surveillance were over. The conspiracy had been too thoroughly exposed to continue operating in the shadows. Sheriff Morrison, a young woman, approached them, notebook in hand. I'm Jennifer Walsh from the Washington Post. I'm working on a book about the Blackwater conspiracy. Could I ask you a few questions? Danny had given hundreds of interviews over the past 6 months, but he still found it surreal that his grandfather's hidden evidence had become the basis for congressional investigations, federal prosecutions, and now books about government cover-ups. What do you want to know? He asked. What made you decide to keep investigating, even after federal agents threatened your life? Danny thought about the question for a moment, looking back toward the mine entrance where 17 men had died trying to protect the truth. I think about my grandfather's letter. The last thing he wrote was, use this evidence to get justice. Use it to expose the conspiracy, and use it to make sure no other families have to suffer what ours has suffered. That's not just advice. That's a responsibility that got passed down through 50 years of secrecy. And now, those 17 families finally know the truth about how their loved ones died. Now the people responsible are facing justice, and now we have protections in place to make sure government agencies can't murder American citizens to steal their natural resources. Jennifer Walsh scribbled notes furiously. Do you think justice has been served? Danny considered the question. Crawford and his team were facing life sentences. The mining companies were paying billions in reparation. Congress was investigating the full scope of the conspiracy and implementing oversight reforms. But 17 men were still dead. Hundreds of other victims would never see justice. And some of the highest-level officials responsible for ordering the murders had escaped prosecution by claiming national security immunity. Justice is being served, Danny said finally, but it's not complete. It may never be complete. The best we can do is make sure the truth is known and prevent it from happening again. As the reporter walked away, Danny's radio crackled with a call from dispatch. Sheriff Morrison, we've got a situation developing at the county courthouse. Large crowd gathering for the memorial service. Danny smiled. Today was the dedication of the James Morrison Memorial, honoring all 17 victims of the Blackwater Mine murders. Families from across the country were gathering to remember loved ones who had been missing for 50 years, finally able to mourn properly and celebrate their courage. On my way, Danny replied. As he drove back toward Matewan, Danny reflected on everything that had changed since he'd found that file in the county archives. The town had become a pilgrimage site for people interested in government accountability and corporate transparency. Property values had increased as historians and journalists moved to the area to research the conspiracy. Most importantly, families that had been scattered and traumatized for decades were finally reconnecting and healing. At the courthouse, Danny found hundreds of people gathered around a simple granite memorial that listed the names of all 17 Blackwater victims. But what moved him most was seeing Carl Hutchkins standing beside the memorial, no longer in hiding, finally able to honor the men he'd watched die 50 years ago. "Sheriff," Hutchkins said as Danny approached, "thank you for finishing what your grandfather started. Thank you for preserving the evidence that made it possible." They stood together in silence for a moment, reading the names carved into the granite. James Patrick Morrison was listed first, identified as lead foreman and truthkeeper. Danny's phone buzzed with another message, this one from a number he didn't recognize. "Sheriff Morrison, my name is Patricia Collins. My father was Deputy R. Collins, who tried to investigate the Blackwater murders in 1962. I have documents my father hid before he was killed in that car accident. I think you'll want to see them." Danny stared at the message, realizing that even 6 months after exposing the Blackwater conspiracy, there were still secrets waiting to be uncovered, still witnesses ready to come forward, still evidence hidden away by people who had refused to let the truth die with them. The fight for justice would continue, but today, 17 miners who had died trying to protect their community were finally being honored for their courage, and James Patrick Morrison's grandson was carrying on the family tradition of refusing to let powerful people bury the truth. Danny looked up at the memorial one more time, then walked toward his patrol car to respond to Patricia Collins's message. After 50 years, the Blackwater Mine conspiracy was over. But somewhere in America there were probably other mines, other victims, and other secrets that needed a small-town sheriff with his grandfather's sense of justice to bring them into the light. Danny Morrison was ready for whatever came next.